Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. And, thank you to the incredible panelists and moderator from the last session. I'm so excited to continue the conversation and talk about some of the crucial intersections between CRT, pedagogy, and curriculum on this panel. And I'm so honored to facilitate this discussion between a group of scholars that I admire, of course, and also very selfishly, I was happy to be asked to do this because CRT is a course that raises a lot of questions for me as an instructor, and so I have plenty of them, and I'm excited to hear your insights. So I was told to keep the introductions brief. I should actually start by introducing myself. My name is Fana Jamal. I'm an assistant professor here and a member of the CRS faculty. Joining us on our panel is Hiroshi Motomura, who is the Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law and faculty co-director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy here at UCLA. He's also the author of several books, including Immigration Outside the Law, Americans in Waiting, and the co-author of Immigration and Citizenship, Process and Policy. And he has a new book, Borders and Belonging Towards a Fair Immigration Policy, for which he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. Adi Rolnick is the Yahaviatum of San Manuel Nation Professor of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William S. Boyd School of Law. She previously served as the inaugural Critical Race Studies Law Teaching Fellow at UCLA, and also represented governments as a lawyer, and tribal governments, as a lawyer and lobbyist. Jonathan Feingold is a professor of law at Boston University School of Law and host of the Race Class podcast, which we'll also have a chance to talk about. Anna Spain Bradley is the MacArthur Foundation Chair in International Justice and Human Rights at UCLA Law and faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA. She previously served as UCLA's Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and she is the author of the forthcoming book, Global Racism, A Challenge for the World, as well as the book Human Choice in International Law, and co-editor of International Dispute Resolution. So thank you so much to all our panelists. So I'm going to begin, or I thought we could sort of start by situating our teaching within this current political moment of anti-radical and anti-intellectual suppression. Today, we take the helm of our classrooms at a time when our government's resources are committed to recasting legitimate political thought, information, and ideas as divisive, illicit, and discriminatory. And for some of us, especially for Black women and for transgender scholars, our very presence in the classroom is cast as the ill-gotten fruits of some illicit diversity or gender con. At the same time, in this moment where repression is imposed through intimidation into forced silence and erasure, the power of our syllabi, our curricula, and the information ideas we share with our students could not be more evident as a threat to an unjust and untenable status quo. So as the first question, I thought, could you each talk about how you are approaching the selection and exclusion of information in your curriculum? How do you approach the question of what ideas matter now and why? And Jonathan, I was hoping you could start us off.
I'm waiting so that I don't eat into my time before my slide goes up. Can someone let me know if the QR codes are working? That's more important than the mic. So, unlike Jerry Kong, I am very sentimental. I come with a lot of emotions in my body. And so, in 4 minutes, I'm going to try to make 4 points. The first is actually a set of questions. The second is about misdiagnosis. The third is about solidarity. And the fourth is about power. So the first, I'm just curious, who here is a student? Formally, all the hands should also be up. Second question, who here know someone who has been negatively impacted by ICE? Who here knows someone who has been the subject of a smear campaign? Who here is affiliated with an institution that has disinvested in their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? My morning was spent dealing with all three of these things happening in my neighborhood and my institution. All of this informs what I bring to class. So that was point one, misdiagnosis. Around September 2020, a whole set of right-wing actors started targeting critical race theory. With the exception of a few folks in this room and institutions like the African American Policy Forum, few took it seriously. At best, we heard the narrative that CRT is a boogeyman that does not exist in our schools. This was a severe misdiagnosis. CRT was attacked because it was a threat to all of the entities that are currently in power in Washington, because the ideas that have germinated in our classrooms and in our scholarship and in our advocacy somehow entered the floods of marchers who took to the streets and did not just protest violence against people racialized as black, but began connecting the dots between environmental degradation, economic precarity, and white supremacy, and just had the basic realization that inequality is not natural. But it should not surprise us that it was critical race theorists who understood that the attack on CRT was just the tip of the spear, just as the attack on affirmative action was just the tip of the spear. Points 3 and 4 are going to have to become in 30-second chunk. Solidarity and power. Many of the folks in this room have written about how systems of white supremacy incentivize groups who exist somewhere in the middle to try to not be on the bottom. And what we've seen is that that does not result in anyone's safety, but rather reinforces the systems that undergird our collective precarity. We also exist within disciplines and institutions that reward our individual excellence and citations as opposed to our collective endeavors. And so our task is to figure out how we work together, notwithstanding all the systems are trying to crack us. And so I will just leave with a question, and that question is, what is your plan? If you don't have a plan, or you're not sure what your plan is, the QR codes are things you should use.
Good morning. Let's see. Good morning. There we go. Welcome, everyone, and especially a warm, warm welcome to all of you who've come here from anywhere else. It is such a privilege and honor for all of us at UCLA and all the great colleagues at CRS and the other programs to host you and to be here and to treat this space as a site of learning, which we're focusing on in this panel, and much, much more. So Fana asks us to think about the project of teaching and learning, and the project now versus how it's changed over time. I think that, for me, I'm entering my 18th year now teaching. I started teaching here at UCLA back in 2007 as a lecturer, before going on the job market. Before that, practiced international law at the State Department and had other careers before that. And the generational shifts we're seeing in the classroom, in life and society, in how people are communicating and sharing information, and how people are feeling, to Jonathan's fine point, have to be underscored in this conversation. And I say this, with lots of students in the room, including Maddie Bello, who's one of our illustrious 3Ls, who are also a part of the project of teaching. So teaching today, in my view, really has to understand something more deeply about the human condition. And a lot of the work that I've done in terms of research has been in the realm of neuroscience and understanding how human choice operates through insights from neuroscience. Now, there are actually real doctors in the room, Dr. Navarro, who's here as Vice Chancellor from our UC San Francisco side, and other folks who can really answer those questions. But one of the things that I write about is this: fear is our most fantastic enemy. It changes what we think by changing how we think. And that's true writ large with the world that we're in right now. So when we as professors and teachers and educators enter a classroom or space of learning, our number one role is to establish a subculture in which learning is in fact possible. And if we're not attending to those core needs as a human being, the core need to feel physically and psychologically safe, we're already behind. So for classrooms, I think it's really important to think about what topics are going to invoke the full array of human condition. And in my classrooms, teaching international law, human rights, we have big topics. We have genocide, we have armed conflicts, we have the situation happening in Gaza, the situation happening with the Rohingya peoples. These are cases at the World Court right now that are being decided, some indeed this week. And when we bring those through the lens of law in the classroom, students who are law students are taught to treat the law, per Aristotle, as reason devoid of passion. But you cannot in your human brain bisect thinking and feeling. This is not neurologically possible. So for me, this is a site of entry to think deeply about what is the project of teaching, how do we create spaces as educators, and what's our responsibility to attend to the truth, to the last panel and Jerry's questions, while also attending to our ability to absorb and process and learn in an environment in which truth is increasingly dangerous.
Good morning. Does this work?
There's a switch at the top.
I just switched it. Better? It's on.
Closer.
Like this?
Yes.
Okay, that's awkward. Good morning. My name is Addie Rolnick. So I came to use. I was a student and a fellow here. I came to UCLA in 2000, so I guess that is exactly when the CRS program started. We couldn't enroll as 1Ls, like we couldn't apply, but we could opt in as 2Ls. And I came partly because I had been introduced to CRT as an undergraduate, and to me, and this has never changed, no matter how much more I've learned, fundamentally the reason that the work I do is informed by critical race theory and why I think it's valuable is it's a set of vocabulary and a set of tools that lets me both understand and explain the things that I think are important in trying to achieve what justice is. And I was sort of sad. I'm happy that I got asked to talk about teaching, because last night I was sad, right? I'm thinking back over 25 years of thinking about these issues. And when I think about the doctrinal work, it feels like the retrenchment is the whole story. So many of us have been writing about issues, and all that's happening right now is we're watching the worst predictions that we ever had come true in the courts. So it doesn't feel good, even though the work has to keep going to think about the writing in some ways. Kamehameha Schools is just sued, as I knew it would be after the Harvard and UNC cases, and I feel like I've been waiting for that to happen since the first time that challenge was rejected. So it's depressing, but I'm actually a lot more optimistic about teaching, and I'm optimistic about teaching in this terrible moment because it feels like students have changed in a certain way, and I think the takeaway of what I want to talk about is everything sucks so much right now for so many people that students are able to see it right away, and teaching concepts that it took me years to teach happen in the first couple of weeks of law school before students even come, which means that we can much more quickly get to the work of actually how to fix things instead of spending most of teaching trying to unlearn some of the bad things that law school teaches. So I haven't taught CRT as a class in about 6 years, and that's partly because I teach at a school. I'm in Nevada. Most of my students don't come to specialize in CRT, and what I found when I taught CRT is that was the first time they talked about race, and sometimes the last time, and we couldn't do what I thought a CRT class should do, so I started teaching civil rights because I knew they needed the doctrine that they weren't getting, and now I mostly do this work in doctrinal classes and increasingly in 1L classes that are designed to get students talking about race in a way that they can use for the rest of their career. So there's 3 kind of what I think of as foundational CRT concepts that I thought I would just talk about briefly that I try to touch on in teaching that I think are actually sort of easier now. So the first is systemic racism. So I think I teach criminal law, and when I started to teach and when I started to write, especially in law, it was hard and took a long time to convince people that systemic racism was a problem in the criminal system. That's not true anymore. For any of you who teach criminal law, everybody comes in knowing that, and that is largely thanks to the work of CRT scholars. We took advantage of this in 2020 so following the summer of 2020, we taught a first-year class in which it was mandatory for all 1Ls, and we taught them what we thought were foundational materials from across multiple disciplines to understand what the debate was about both the problems and the solutions with criminal justice. And I think it was largely successful. And our student body is at least half very conservative, but they were able to have those conversations. Second is the critique of neutrality. So this is kind of my favorite thing that has become easier. I used to spend a long time in federal Indian law and in civil rights, walking students through the history of an area of doctrine so that until they saw the court's not following its own precedent. What's going on? These rules are supposed to work. I must not understand it. And then after a while, we could talk about how maybe there wasn't a clear rule that the court was following. Now that happens when I teach standing in the second week of constitutional law. Immediately everybody knows that the law is a political tool, and then we can talk about it doesn't feel as unnatural to use the law as a political tool for the ends that my students might want to use it for. And the third that I just want to mention is I think one of the most beautiful things about CRT scholarship is the ability to reframe. And I've increasingly been using that reframing in teaching. Most recently, I taught a class that is structured all around critical race judgments and feminist judgments. And so I basically let 1L students read the cases that they do in other classes, and then they read the critical judgment, and they get a chance to see a whole different story and a whole different outcome immediately, which then, because my goal is not to let law school keep students from being able to imagine an outcome that's outside the box of what we're given in law school. And I think that's critical for anyone who's lawyering in an area where the doctrine is really bad, as most of us have been.
Thank you all for being here today. This is so great to be here and to see so many folks I've known for a while now. Feels like a reunion of sorts. So let me just start with something that Fauna mentioned. I mean, she talked about forced silence and erasure. I want to first talk about erasure and how that affects the classroom, and then talk about exactly one way of thinking about how to go fight back against erasure. And this is not a complete list, but the kind of erasure we're seeing is an erasure of social context. It's an erasure of practical realities when law is applied to real situations. I'm struck at how oftentimes some people in the Supreme Court, how they describe police encounters, just to be a very concrete example. And it's also erasure of history and context for law. And so I think these questions of context and practical realities of history demand much more teaching emphasis than ever before. Now, I think I've tried always to do this in my teaching, but I think the demand is much greater. And so the question really is how do we go about this? One thing I've picked up in my teaching career is that we only do two things in law school, or we only talk about two things. I'm going to reduce law school to two words. We talk about how to argue, and I think we talk about how to predict. And by prediction, I don't mean looking at the future, but looking at the past and seeing where things are going, and looking more broadly at what you put in a brief, and thinking more broadly about what's happening in the case, what you tell a client, what you tell a social movement. We argue and we predict. And these are, asylum is an example I'm going to use, but political asylum or whatever you want, humanitarian protection. But one treatment of the topic is what you put in a brief. This is what we argue, this is doctrine. At some level, I suppose we get good at this, right? But I think one of the frustrations that people feel coming into law school is you get in a first-year class and you say, well, we're just learning how to put in a brief. What about all that other stuff? What about reality? What about social context? What about structural racism? What about a lot of things that really matter? And it turns out that a lot of that goes into what I'm calling how to predict. If you represent someone who's asking for asylum, you're gonna put it through a filter of what the law is, but you're also gonna ask. You're going to ask about, well, what country are you from? What's the racial aspect of this? What's the foreign policy aspect? Are you really going to win under those contexts? So one of the things I found, and I've done this for a while now, but I think I'm doing it more, is to think about the classroom as a place where you teach. I teach actually two parallel classes at the same time. And a lot of times I'm very explicit about this. We're now going to talk about the argument part. Now, we're going to say that doesn't really matter at all. Let's talk about what's really going to happen. And this is where you can discuss, among other things, in broader context, how structural racism and other forms of normalized injustice permeate the classroom. And I think that there's a lot of resonance in that kind of realization. First of all, it deconstructs law school. It makes people understand why it seems so narrow. But it also, I think, very importantly, raises up and makes part of the real goal in the real context, understanding what you do with this. And so I mean, I can't get through 4 minutes without making a musical reference, so I will. I think good musicians know scales. I think good musicians know modes, if you want to go a little further than that. But that's not music, right? You got to know those things, but you've got to figure out how you use them and how you make music, how you put emotion into it, and how you put impact into it. And so I think thinking about law school as a matter of argument, but the prediction in the broad sense of context, historical, social, structural racism, many other things, I really want to suggest a need to think about every course in that context. And this is, I think, the conceptual basis for thinking about how to approach, for many years I taught civil procedure every year, and I found it was so natural to talk about what's really going to happen. And that empowers, and in a sense, emphasizes the importance of knowing what to put in a brief, but contextualizes it.
The next question I'm going to pose to Anna. So, and it builds well off of some of the remarks made in the last conversation. Many of us find the U.S.-centered nature of our classes on race and law increasingly at odds with the globalized classroom. By this, I don't only mean that we are teaching an increasing number of international students and students with a background or interest in international law, but many of our students are also protesting for justice in Palestine, and their demands that institutions disclose and divest from war profiteering draw explicitly on the linkages between international and domestic policies. But racial formations are deeply impacted by time, place, and history, and imbricated with questions of nationality, xenophobia, language, and ethnicity that are state-specific and can feel difficult to tackle all in the course of one semester. So your work sheds incredible light on the importance of confronting this pedagogical tension in order to prepare students to confront global racial hierarchy. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what you deem global racism, the title of your forthcoming book. Why, if at all, should we be engaging the connection between the domestic and the international in our courses on race and law? And what are some strategies to do so?
Well, I thank you for asking about my forthcoming book. So to situate this, yeah, Fana's right, the last panel. So Asla's nice, fantastic stretching of how CRT, third world approaches to international law, connected in the origin story, largely but not exclusively at Harvard Law School in the late 80s and early 90s. And there's also another part of that tradition. And that's the tradition through which I'm writing I've finished writing, the book is now in editing, this project. So, Invisible Man, 1950, Ralph Ellison, how many of you have read it? Oh, okay, this is great. My husband's an Ellison scholar, so this is a part of our house. Whatever else America is, it is also somehow black. Those are the words of Ralph Ellison. I think there is a parallel to say that whatever else world order and international law has become, it is also somehow black. And there is, the book starts in 1943 with the birth of a dark-skinned black boy in Florida off a military base whose father was in the segregated army during World War II. A few years later, the UN Charter comes into being. A few years later, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights comes into being. And these instruments that start to grow the tradition of international law and human rights on the scale of world order are in touch with, but not satisfactorily eradicating the oppression of black people in the United States, black Americans, and other many people around the world. The story of that boy is the story of my father, William G. Spain, who sadly passed away a few months ago. And the project of the book comes out of his life story and much of my family's life story in the South in segregation. But it extends to questions about human identity. Global racism is my naming of a form of racism that causes harms to millions of people in ways that are already recognized as internalized, interpersonal, systemic, structural, but also are something more. Global racism attempts to trace the contours of that other layer. It could possibly be a substructure, like the mycelium of roots in the forest floor. It could possibly be a superstructure, the way that we've come to think of global climate change, connecting local weather events to something greater and yet unseen. And the part of the book that's really been a journey for me, a growth journey, is it's on OUP's trade arm. It's one of their first attempts to publish this topic for a global public audience. So writing through law to try to reach a more broader conversation and dialogue with people from everywhere, that they can see themselves a part of this story. And that's something that I brought home with the teaching. So here at UCL Law, a few years ago, students really put forward the need to have more courses on TWAIL and other topics. And so we've introduced a new course that we're recentering international law through the lens of Black traditions, TWAIL, global critical race feminism, Adrienne Wing's work, and others, and in the tradition of Hank Richardson's III, who was the grandfather of Black traditions and international law, and who sadly passed away a few weeks ago. So this is a way of saying we want to treat world order and legal questions therein as if the people who've been excluded were always a part of it. Not at the periphery, but always in the center. And I think that's part of the motivation for teaching right now, is to really recenter so much that has been excluded and attempted to be erased, and ask ourselves, what is the project of law writ large? What is the project of humanity writ large through this recentering?
Thank you. Question I'll also pose to the entire group. Since its inception, CRT has been deeply intertwined with student activism and agency, and I love teaching Professor Harris's introduction to CRT to illuminate this point. Students have been central to the proliferation of our field, demanding increased offerings in the study of race and law at their institutions, demanding an increase in faculty whose research interests are grounded in the tenets of CRT. Students take our courses and our clinics and support our research, of course, in countless ways. And many of our students confront psychological and, of course, physical intimidation to play significant roles in every social movement on and also off campus, from the movement for Black Lives to the movement for Palestinian liberation. The centrality of student agency to CRT, though, stands in direct contrast to reigning practices in legal pedagogy, practices that reinforce asymmetrical power and authority between professors and students. So what are some tactics and approaches that can help disrupt these power asymmetries and infuse our teaching with more student agency, authority, and power? And I ask that, I've been asked to let you know to please speak directly into the mic for the good of the overflow room when you answer the question. Perhaps we could start with you, Hiroshi.
Calling on me. So can you hear this okay? No. Closer. That close. No, it's okay. I think the battery on this. Okay, thanks. Okay. Is that better? No, that's better. All right. Great. Okay. So, I think that I suppose my answer, this is really about student empowerment. It's really about authority and power, not just in the classroom, but in institutions. So let me build on some of the stuff I said earlier, but really talking about what matters is, even if doctrine matters, what really matters is situating in the social and political and historical context that makes you see patterns of subordination through law, normalization of injustice through law, structural racism, and many other things. So, I'm going to be very classroom focused here. I think that makes us, or at least for me, it's made me really rethink what so-called doctrinal courses are. And I think, in a nutshell, they need to be more like clinical education. And what does that mean? It's not just to understand what the rules are, but to understand, and I think more importantly, how to use rules, when not to use rules, when cases matter because you might win, when cases matter because they're part of a larger communications or advocacy campaign. And I think that when you ask those questions, you're forced to combine, I think, a key knowledge of society, politics, and history. And that's the only way you can really talk in a classroom about how the law matters to concrete people, communities, and for basic types of power relationships. Now, this means, I'm getting even more concrete here, this means having a doctrinal discussion, a doctrinal course, and then saying, wait a minute, let's not worry about the doctrine. Let's talk about how you would find a plaintiff if this were an impact litigation case. Let's talk about the tension between the principle that emerged from the case and the choices the advocates must have made that, at least I hope that they made intentionally, to try to argue for the individual or for the organization, but also to ask for the rule that would be the most important thing. And sometimes that means having a conversation about which I've had, what's the best way to lose this case? Now, so I bring this stuff in class all the time, and I got to tell you this. Some of my students find this really annoying. When I ask them, forget what the rule, I don't care about the rule is. What were the tactical, societal choices that the lawyers made in bringing this case? Should it even have been brought? And those are hard questions to answer. They're participatory conversational questions. And like I said, this doesn't fit necessarily the model of what a lot of people think they should be doing in a law school classroom. But it does fit, I think, with what a lot of people do think we should do. The other thing I'll say is that I think that we need to really think about clinical education, too, on the other side, because it suggests that clinical education has to be more infused than sometimes it is with this concern for society, politics, and history. It's really not just responding to the immediate need and the task, which I don't want to minimize. That's really important, to do what you can for a particular client, whether it's an individual or an organization or a movement, but really that to think more deeply in the clinic about the context in which clinical education takes place, and to really say, how do we want to win this case? What is the argument we want to make? How do we deal with this case in a way that's not just about winning the case as a case, but thinking about the contribution that this case might make to a broader social movement, and to discuss that with all those concerned and impacted. And I think that's a way to think about clinical education. So I really think, sometimes my students tell me that my doctrinal class is the closest they've come in a doctrinal class to being a clinic. And that's great. I love hearing that. But I teach a clinic as well, and I've had students tell me, the clinic is most like being in a doctrinal class in a clinic. And I'm not sure if they mean it in such as complimentary sort of way, but it is true. I think that in some ways that this division we've had traditionally between doctrinal classes and clinical education or experiential education. There's a lot of blurring of that, luckily, that's going on, but I think that we ought to be at least intentional and conscious of the choices we're making when we structure the classes the way we are. And I think, this last point, I think that sharing this and having both registers in all types of classes is actually quite empowering. Much of what I think is disempowering about law school is people don't know the answer to the question, what's going on here? What are we doing? So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you.
So this question was the hardest one for me to prepare for in a way, because part of me just thinks it's not, if the question is how not to reproduce these terrible power dynamics, just don't, right? I think in a way it seems easy. But I thought I would just talk about, I guess in teaching for me, there's really two things I'm always trying to do. So one is thinking about how to facilitate conversations about race using perspectives and tools that I've gotten from CRT more broadly, like across the whole school. So that's kind of happening in various ways, right? There's now an ABA requirement that students learn about race. So how can we make sure that that's happening, which is not the same as kind of teaching to the students who are coming to do CRT. So the second thing I'm also trying to do is teach to and support the students who came to law school. I think Emmanuel said it really well yesterday. You have this experience where you come to do some sort of justice-related work, and then people are asking about law firms, and law firms are asking you why you're going to. So when I interviewed at law firms, they asked, why should they hire me? Because obviously I was committed to doing Indian law, so I couldn't possibly work for them. So this idea that in order to be a good lawyer, you have to be an empty vessel that doesn't have any of your own commitments doesn't really work for students who came to pursue a certain goal. So I think with regard to teaching those students, which I think is a lot of what UCLA is very good at, but is harder in a school where you don't have a program, some of it, again, seems rudimentary. I talk to students a lot about finding friends that they can talk to after they deal with things that are hard in classes. That's part of law school, is some of this is hard to talk about. So find people that you don't have to explain it to after class, about having outlets that are not school and that are not work. But really about not, telling those students that I don't want them to burn out in their first year, because they're everywhere, right? They're at protests, and they're leading organizations, and they're trying to fight the administration, and I don't want them not to be lawyers, even though it feels in the first year like this is the worst soul-sucking place that you could possibly be. And I think it's, UCLA is unique in that it's created a space in which there are a lot of students like that, so it's possible to kind of cushion that feeling. At anyone who's teaching at another school where there isn't a program of that sort, it can be lonelier. So I think a lot of the work of teaching is not so much about what I do in the classroom, but about making sure that I'm talking to those students and recognizing what they're trying to do. And although I like to credit CRS for almost everything in how I've learned to teach, I actually credit PILP, the Public Interest Program, which I also did here, because the other thing that I think is important in teaching and in thinking about raising people who will be lawyers is this idea that you don't choose a method. Maybe you have a goal, and then your method is whatever method you need to do. And so I first learned that because PILP, I think at the time, had a seminar where we had to learn legislative advocacy, litigation advocacy, organizing. We had to learn multiple methods because it takes multiple methods to achieve a goal. And when I practiced Indian law representing tribes, we did the same thing without talking about it as clearly, which was we lobbied, we did informational work, we litigated, whatever we needed to do to achieve the goal that our clients needed to achieve, and that seems to me to be the right way to teach lawyering, but it isn't the way law schools usually teach it. So I think that's the teaching component of it. The last piece that I want to address, though, is I sort of wasn't sure if I wanted to say this. The question of kind of translating these ideas more broadly to all students, not just supporting the students who are committed to doing this work. I think that faculty have to get out of the way, and I don't mean, and by this I mean law school faculties more broadly. So I've taught at a couple of schools where I've been involved in first-year classes in which we're facilitating student conversations around race. And what I have found is that the students are ready to have those conversations, and the faculty are so hung up in their own investments in colorblindness and their own discomfort that they ruin the conversations. And the reason I was sort of afraid to talk about this is that I did this I taught a class for 3 years that I thought went well among the students at UNLV, and I think ultimately my diagnosis of it is that it was killed by the faculty because they were uncomfortable with it, not the students. So I think in terms of facilitating these conversations more broadly, as Cheryl was saying yesterday, students sort of know how to talk about these things, and faculty perhaps just have to listen.
So I'm gonna turn on the mic, and I'm gonna sort of answer the question from a slightly different vantage point. But first, to share that the 3 classes that I teach are property law in the first year, education law, and then a critical race theory seminar. And I've been really blessed with wonderful students, especially, maybe not especially, but certainly this semester, teaching education law in a CRT seminar. The students are deeply engaged and generous with me and each other, and that matters. So as a short aside before I maybe say what I really plan to say now, I am not teaching, for anyone who's been on the academic job market, you're supposed to list the classes that you might teach. I did not list property. I told the institution that ultimately hired me, of course I will teach property, only after telling them I don't know how to teach contracts when they previously asked me, which was a mistake. Sorry to everyone who coached me along the way. I didn't put property down because trying to think through I don't try to teach property in the way that I was taught property. The way that I was taught, it was inaccessible, arcane. It made little sense to me. And it wasn't until teaching property, and it wasn't until Kesu Park started writing about how to teach property that I realized that property is a class about racial power. I love teaching property. Not because I love racial power, but because students don't realize what's coming in property class. But so, to answer my question now that I've filibustered myself for a couple minutes, so I want to answer the question about thinking about sort of student engagement activism a little bit more structurally, and sort of situate against the backdrop of whether it's 9 months, whether it's 2 years, in which much of the repression that we've seen against students has not come from the federal government, well, it has not come from the Trump administration, but has come from the institutions in which they inhabit. Institutions often understood as liberal institutions, often understood as having too many faculty members who do not, have diverse perspectives. And in many respects, that's not new, even if the level or severity of the repression, the militarization of the repression, the criminalization of student activism is more than I had ever experienced in my lifetime. But my sense is for most folks who enter critical race spaces, a lot of us cut our teeth fighting with our institutions. Often because our institutions said they did certain things, and did not do those things. And for me, the past 9 months has clarified things. I wrote an article a few years ago that referred to institutions like Harvard and the University of North Carolina as ambivalent advocates of affirmative action. I think if I were to write that now, I would say opportunistic advocates. But so in thinking about how to support students, I think the conversation has to be structural in the sense that we think about the incentives that drive our institutions. Why is it that I get daily spam from law deans telling me how wonderful their schools are now that I have tenure? None of whom have told me how their schools are doing anything in order to blunt our autocratic turn or to stand up for their students and their faculty members who are trying to speak truth, and there are truths. A separate question that we have to contend with, again, this is structural, is about governance. Where is it that formal power lies within our institutions? Why is it that so many of the stakeholders, the constituencies, have no formal power? And why is it that CRT has yet to really, with full bore, enter domains of nonprofit corporate governance, corporate law, spaces that I did not come close to in law school, but I would have, had I known that there was actually a sort of deep need to understand those bodies of law. And then the third is debt, which is also a conversation about why it's easy for big law firms to punish and police students and their advocacy on campus, and part of it is because of decades of defunding of education in the country, because many of the gains that have now been rolled back or in the process of being rolled back were the product of students who are able to access higher education and demand that those institutions be different. Which is just to say that on the one hand, I love talking about the classroom. I don't think we should overly tether ourselves to conversations about what's happening in our classroom unless we're also talking about the structures, the political economy of the institutions that we exist and how they, in many respects, continue to serve the law firms that are now deciding that it's not in their interest to be giving small stipends to affinity groups because for some reason it's not in their interest.
I'm going to pose the next question to Hiroshi. So studying critical race theory has long provided students the opportunity to question the value and also the risks associated with situating certain claims in the language of legal rights. So in your incredibly comprehensive and very readable book, Borders and Belonging, you situate claims to more just immigration policy along two axes, humanity claims and also belonging claims. What do these claims mean, and how is race central to each type of claim? And could you also talk a little bit about what informed your decision to situate your analysis using notions of belonging and humanity claims and any relation that might have to pedagogy?
So, first, thank you for mentioning my book. Yeah, I mean, first of all, just as a preface to the answer, I mean, this is a question about my scholarship on a panel about teaching. And I think it's very fair, but let me explain to you why. Because when I write, when I publish, I just think I'm teaching. I'm just, maybe the audience is different. Maybe it's not that different, but I mean, I'm just trying to be a teacher more than anything else. I think it's very fair to ask about scholarship in a panel on teaching. So there's two parts to the answer. One is just to kind of lay some foundation for what I mean by humanity claims and belonging claims, but then talk about the teaching moves. In the broad sense of the word teaching that are going on there. I think that the distinction, there's the kinds of challenges that are made to national borders really operate in two different registers. One register is to think about it in terms of what I'm calling humanity claims, which basically is saying it's the notion that there are things that national borders do to people that no human being should have to endure. But what I'm calling belonging claims is the idea that sometimes the way you challenge the operation of national borders is to say that those borders are being used to erase, to silence your own belonging and your claim to be there. Right? I mean, and what I'm calling, part of this move is really just calling for an intentionality about these claims are not mutually exclusive, but they often operate in in tandem. They often can overlap, but there are many cases where one situation, in situations where one type of claim is be more powerful depending on the audience to another. So it's really, in that sense, a call for intentionality. And to give you examples of this, I mean, I think that racism in immigration and citizenship law clearly disrespects humanity claims, and enforcement measures often multiplies this racism by inflicting harm that no human being should endure. But I also think that that racism in immigration and citizenship law can also disrespect someone's claim to belong and to be recognized. And that, of course, is very, to me, obvious in the whole history of immigration and citizenship law, not just in its formal dimensions, but also in the way it's practiced. So what are the teaching moves here? One is to try to take ideas and try to untether them from the constraints of accepted terminology. And when you really think about it, I mean, the terms human rights could be community claims, right? I mean, substituting humanity claims for human rights, and I'm substituting belonging claims for civil rights. Why? Because I think both of those terms carry with them an implicit faith in the recognition of rights, and the recognition of rights as what matters. The role of courts is what matters. What really matters, and it's kind of the lawyer's way of thinking about this, frankly. But what really matters is the way people say, this is happening to me and it shouldn't happen to me. And that's really what I'm calling a claim. I also think that there's a lot of baggage with these rights, these terms, human rights and civil rights. It implies an institutional structure. It involves a certain way of thinking. It sort of evokes a lot of academic debates. And it's also very geographically bounded. I mean, civil rights, in many ways, we might think of in this country in a certain way that's going to be very distinct from how it's talked about in other countries. And so sometimes this kind of process, I think, is to really interrogate the terminology we use and use terminology that in many respects is as plain, as intuitive as possible, and its common sense is to speak really in the register of common sense. And I think if you do that, then it becomes a lot of the things that I think that we've been talking about, whether it's various forms of normalized subordination or structural racism, really become part of the common sense way you do it. And that's a way of deconstructing what law does.
Thank you. So the next question I'm going to pose to Addie. So every year I teach your article, Indigenous Subjects, and I love teaching it. And I love engaging with your critique of the U.S. Supreme Court's 2000 opinion in Rice v. Cayetano. The case struck down an ancestry-based voting restriction designed to protect Indigenous Hawaiians, or Indigenous Hawaiian self-determination, by equating it with a race-based voter exclusion. Something that consistently comes up when I teach this case is the court's use of history to lay the foundation for its subsequent attack on Indigenous Hawaiians. The court's reading of the historical records reminds us of the importance of integrating historical account into the classroom, something that Ariella mentioned earlier. And something that's especially true as we begin to witness the fallout of these laws that prohibit teaching of a host of different social justice histories and texts. So how might we engage histories of settler colonialism in our law school courses? What responsibilities or obligations do we have to do so, and particularly as legal scholars?
Yeah, thank you. I hope this not close enough? Okay. I hope you cut the article down because it's too long. So thank you, Asla, for answering this question already about why it's important to teach settler colonialism and to engage it in law school. Yes, I think we have an obligation to do it, and this is part of just reframing that I was talking about earlier. Like, the full story has to be told, the full history has to be told, and very often, and this is not unique to cases about Indigenous people, but it's certainly in those cases, the court is lying and telling a partial or a completely inaccurate historical story. This is what the court does about racism all the time in order to facilitate an outcome. So the correct history is an important corrective. So what I want to talk about, though, is kind of how we do this. I think it's really important to talk about settler colonialism and colonization more broadly in law school, and I think it's weirdly hard. So there's two reasons that I think it's hard. One is that it's just about law in general. So settler colonialism, if you really acknowledge it, unsettles foundational aspects of law. Meaning, if you really take a history of settler colonialism seriously, then property law is illegitimate. U.S. sovereign power is illegitimate. And that's sort of what we come to law school in general as a starting point of just sort of saying, well, this is the rule, this is how we treat property. So unsettling that can be hard. That's why I think law schools have been much slower to engage with thinking about colonialism than other disciplines have. I also think that sort of unsettling power it can affect outcomes, right? So this is why in land claim cases, U.S. courts go to great lengths using racialization to characterize indigenous land claims as less legitimate than European land claims, and why, in the end, even when the U.S. acknowledges that they have misbehaved and done something wrong and broken a treaty, all that tribes can ever get back is money, never the land, because it's too unsettling. And the unsettling is, I think, why it's hard to talk about settler colonialism for many people in the context of Israel, because if you feel, for many, many reasons I think people do, that Israeli sovereignty is kind of delicate and in need of protection, then acknowledging any history that might unsettle that legitimacy is really, really threatening. So I think that's just something about law. I also think there's something specific about federal Indian law and something else that's important, which is the idea of sovereignty. So federal Indian law focuses not on colonization, but on the story of sovereignty, self-determination, and tribal agency. And that can accidentally mean that we don't tell the full story of colonization. But I think both are important, right? So what I would say is it's not responsible to engage only with a story of colonization in law school classes without also talking about tribal agency, self-determination, and sovereignty. And it's possible to do these things very badly. So where I want to end is just thinking about maybe how not to do it badly. And by badly, I mean when I see clamoring for a land acknowledgement that someone writes really quickly saying, we are on the unceded territory of this nation. Well, it's not always unceded territory. Sometimes what the nation did is cede the territory in a treaty because they were sovereign and they were using that sovereignty and making a decision. So erasing that reality isn't a better story. The story comes from telling both truths. And so I've done it most in the context of the territories. I think it's really hard to do it because most people in law school haven't thought about the territories at all. And so I try to do it real quickly now in constitutional law. I have the students right after the Commerce Clause read Indian Commerce Clause, plenary power cases involving tribes and the territories, and they think about congressional power in this completely different way. They didn't realize, many of them, that there were non-state territories. And then the first thing that they think is, well, that's so unfair. After reading Downs versus Bidwell, Puerto Rico should be fully incorporated in the United States and American Samoans should be citizens. And then that's a jumping off point for thinking about how many of the people who live in the Pacific territories are indigenous people and how full incorporation might not actually be a solution to the problem of colonization that they've experienced. And it makes us have to think about sovereignty at least a little bit. So it's important to do both, to engage with sovereignty and to engage with colonization. And I think it's really dangerous to do one and not the other in law.
Thank you. And our final question will end where we began with Jonathan, and then afterwards we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So Jonathan, it's been really wonderful to witness how, in response to attacks on CRT and DEI and a host of other social justice frameworks, you've engaged in some of the important work of public pedagogy through your podcast series, Race Class, and through some of your other public work, some of which you mentioned. Because of the powerful campaign to propagandize people against CRT, many of us find ourselves engaged in public dialogue about the origins, the values, the meaning of CRT with groups who have newly heard of the field and have often consumed some misinformation about what we study and why we study it. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what drove you to take this turn in a more public-facing pedagogy about CRT. What conversations has it allowed you to have, or maybe stymied, if you want to talk about that? And what lessons can you share with us about talking about CRT to groups outside of the academy?
Thanks, Fauna. And another thanks to Ida and Jasleen, Melissa, Maddie, and everyone who made this possible. It is a real honor and pleasure to be here. So I started my position at BU in January of 2020. I am a product of this CRS program here. I was first exposed to critical race theory as a junior at Vassar College in a class with Luke Harris. And, you know, there's a lot of, could share a lot more. But I did not identify as a critical race theorist when I got to BU, in part because I didn't think my scholarship was particularly critical. And it was the attacks on CRT that was when I started very publicly identifying as a critical race theorist. And my scholarship, I think, subsequently has become more critical. I think there's some ways where it's like sort of critical. I'm critical of many things. But however I would have described myself, I've always benefited from the concepts and the tools that, I was first exposed to my junior year of college, and then was able to sort of better appreciate here and then in other contexts. But the origin story of the podcast is the attacks on critical race theory, but also teaching a class on the limitations of anti-discrimination law. And in that class, with my students, we as lawyers, and I will tell you, I have very particular feelings about lawyers and law schools and how we position lawyers as the problem solvers, which I think is to our collective detriment. But I take very seriously language and precision and textual analysis. And so what I did with my students in that class was we looked at some of the early bans that were publicly described and understood as anti-CRT, and I asked them, just based on the plain text, would this prohibit what we are doing here, the ideas we're encountering? And what I took away from that conversation, that many of the quote-unquote the concepts, the divisive concept, prohibited concepts, in many respects are sort of mundane anti-discrimination commitments, such as no racial group is superior to another racial group, such as it is inappropriate to discriminate against one racial group. And so I was like, it turns out if you take the language seriously, this either permits or maybe even mandates critical race theory. Because if you read folks like Kim Crenshaw, Cheryl Harris, Jerry Kong, the dozens of folks in this room, it turns out that this all helps us understand why hierarchy is problematic. And so what I have tried to do in the different venues where I try to speak is to, try to be as precise as possible with language so that we don't inadvertently close off doors or close doors where there's actually a lot of opportunity to resist in creative and different sorts of ways.
Thank you. I think now we'll open it up to audience questions. We have a mic here and... Let's see if it works. Okay.
It does.
We have a question in the back. Thank you.
I'll go as fast as I can.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this panel. My name is Michelle. I'm a housing justice attorney in New York City, and I'm also a yoga teacher. And my question is basically, how do you teach resilience or model resilience? We talked a lot about teaching students how to lose a case. We talked a lot about facing pushback from our institutions. And I know, and I'm sure other people can relate, that when we go out of law school and we're practicing or we're teaching, we experience a lot of loss and a lot of grief. If we come from a progressive mindset, we have to get used to losing. So how do you teach students to not burnout to keep on fighting, even despite that. I know for me, my yoga practice was essential in that. I was at a period where I was burning out, and turning to yoga really helped me. But I kind of wish when I was in law school that was taught more explicitly, or was modeled more explicitly. So I wonder what you think about that. How do you teach resilience, or how do you model resilience? Thank you.
I don't know that I teach it. I guess I'm not sure that I believe resilience can be taught. I think maybe that whole industry is a lie. But I think what I think matters to me is acknowledgement of. So anyone who works in any area that I work in is going to lose cases a lot. But not just that. I do a lot of work around children and policing. And so if you're going to work in that area, it's not just that you're going to lose a lot, but everything is going to be gruesome and horrible. And you're going to be seeing the awful stuff happen every day. And so that's important to acknowledge. I talk in criminal law. I actually talk about how that happens for me, that every year when I teach criminal law, there's a different case that like sends me off the rocker for something about kids or domestic violence that triggers something in me, and I just talk to them about how that's going to happen for them. I can't teach them how to deal with that, and if they don't want to deal with that, then it's a legitimate choice to sort of not choose a practice that makes you deal with it every day. But I think being honest about the fact that that's going to happen is important. I also do lots of things. I mean, I spent all of law school as a boxer on the side, because that was how I got through law school. And I was super late to property class all the time because of it. I'm not trying to teach them to do that, but I think one of the ways I try to model it is by not taking, I had a student come to me and say, I really aspire to be like you because you tell us not to take law school super seriously. And that was really nice to hear, just because if it is serious, it's all that I do, but if we take it too seriously, like it's really crippling. And then the third thing, and we haven't talked about this at all, but I have 3 kids. I did my first symposium here with one of them tied to me. And the other thing I do is, if students have other things going on, whether it's kids or anything else, also being honest about that. And by that I mean everyone who says that they can hide their kids and do their job is lying. And I just tell students that they're lying. So I don't think I'm modeling resilience. I think I'm just telling them the truth about how everybody else is lying.
Well, this is the moment to confess that I was late constantly to civil procedure class because of pinball, not boxing. But I got pretty good at pinball at the end of law school. I'm going to do kind of maybe a classic and maybe a obnoxious lawyering thing and talk about what I mean by resilience, or how do you think about resilience. I mean, I think that when I think about that, I think about 2 different kinds of things, and it's a distinction that I think some of you have heard me talk about before between hope and optimism. I mean, there's a moment when a lot of what makes us feel not resilient is because we're losing optimism or we have pessimism, and that's kind of a statement about the state of the world, right? Now, on that, I think one of the things that we tend to focus on too much in the United States or in law schools is what the Supreme Court does, but it tends to ignore a lot of things that happen in the lower courts, that happen in cases, that happen in communities based on what not just lawyers but others do, and so those are sources of optimism, and it's a source of optimism also to realize that social movements require many people being humble enough to realize they're not doing it alone. So there's optimism, but I think hope is different. I mean, hope is a state of the mind. It's a state of the heart. And I think that comes in many respects from community. It's from understanding that you are part of a larger thing, and that much of the story of social movements and the successes that they achieved were contributed to by people who did it because it was the right thing to do in that moment, in that day, and not knowing if they would even live to see what it was that would happen. I mean, that's a story of many, many things, and I think that realizing that is actually a form of empowerment, because it realizes that there's a reason for the community and there's power to be gained in that community, and I think that's a lot of resilience. And I think that actually goes back to this teaching question, because I think it goes back to how that's developed, not just in the classroom per se, but in the spaces where we talk about what we do. That's a form of community. It's a form of communication.
Would you like to add? Yes, we can turn. I actually wanted to ask about the attacks because I'm now in Texas, where clearly there have been some. And one of the messages that we've been getting is, your research is safe. That's your safe space. That's your sanctuary. But teaching is going to be more problematic. And so, we've had a student recorded a class, posted it at the legislature, then attacked, and 3 people are gone, 4 now with Mark Welsh. But I wondered if you think that distinction is real, that teaching is a more dangerous space for us now than our research, or whether that's a kind of Maginot line that will collapse under pressure.
Thank you for the question. It's such an important one. And, wasn't sure I wanted to go here this morning, but I'll say, hypothetically speaking, Jerry founded our Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. Jonathan was there for many years, and then I came in following Jerry's fine footsteps. And I think just going to the straight centers of power, whether they're universities, in workplaces, in other public and private spaces, the question is who's going to throw you under the bus when there's a public outcry about something, and who's going to protect you. And it's a power question. So absolutely, I do not think that we can say research is safe and teaching is not, or vice versa. I think that when convenient, individuals are put in front of the institution. The institutions will protect themselves. And that's not to be cynical, that's just to be realist. But what I do think matters is being very strategic within the power. One of the things that we need to figure out in higher ed, writ large, what we talked about a little bit yesterday, is where the lines of protection are and where they're not, and be very honest about that. What is discrimination and what is and isn't allowed in a classroom academic space around academic freedom and free speech? And this goes to definitional questions of where's the line between things like anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? Where's the line between talking honestly through research and law about world events and people feeling offended and therefore also discriminated against? And how do we define discrimination in that context? So I absolutely think this is the conversation that CRT and many other fields need to push to the fore of higher education. And higher education is not about to get out ahead of society, of the Supreme Court, of centers of power, unless we frame the conversation as a need to do just that. It's a power conversation.
Vana, do you mind if I add a quick? So the answer is no. But to say a little bit more and to build a little bit on what I think Kesu and some others were saying last night, we are in this moment of much destruction, which comes with it opportunity for everyone, and it's not predetermined, and it's not pre.
Everyone can hear this all right?
It's not predetermined where this goes, but what is deeply contested right now, maybe more so, than before, but also sort of more ripe for sort of reimagination, is what do we mean by terms like academic freedom? Where do we situate values like equality in relation to liberty? And historically, I think in many of our institutions, there's been generally a sort of a dichotomy or a split or sort of a siloing of these things. But I think what we are seeing right now, and to get sort of academic-y for a minute, there's a deeply co-constitutive relationship between equality and freedom. And that sort of locates on our campuses, in which one cannot, I don't think in a sort of a conceptual way or a practical way, decouple the attacks on equality and the attacks on academic freedom. Because we cannot be institutions of meaningful knowledge production with sort of anything close to the free and open inquiry and critical evaluation of competing ideas if we are not actively engaged in countering all the systems that both exclude people, diminish perspectives, and are comfortable with a particular status quo, which is just a long way of saying I think it's really important that folks who do critical work, critical race work, intervene into conversation about academic freedom, because that is terrain that is contested right now. And part of what we need to do is figure out how to have a vision of academic freedom that doesn't fall back into sort of a standard decoupling of freedom on one side and equality on the other.
Okay, well, I want to be mindful of the time, so thank you all so much, and please join me in thanking the panel.